Should you accept less money in order to work remotely? Well, stick around because in this video, I'm going to share with you my thoughts on this subject. Hey everybody, it's Brian from A Life After Layoff, and today I want to talk to you about remote work and compensation. So there is some conversation going around right now about distributed workforces and compensation philosophy, and specifically about if you are a remote worker, would you take less in order to maintain that, I guess we could call it a privilege, and an extension of that is would you take less depending on where you decide to live. The reason why this is becoming such a big issue is that Google has recently announced that they are going to be potentially determining pay rates for distributed workforce depending on where exactly you live. According to Reuters, Google has announced a pay cut for remote workers who decide to relocate. And essentially what that means is that if you lived in an expensive area at the time that you got the offer and the assumption was that you were going to stay in that area, you would be compensated based on the local market wage. And that's a pretty common compensation philosophy where wage ranges are determined regionally. And specifically when you look at Google, a lot of their employees would probably be pretty close to their headquarters in Silicon Valley. And as we all know, the cost of living is a lot higher in Silicon Valley than it might be in other places in the country. Say you're a software developer and you got an offer to work out of their Silicon Valley location or headquarters. And as the workforce shifted to a more distributed or remote situation, you decided to move to Iowa. And in Iowa, obviously the cost of living is going to be a lot lower than it would be in California. Should you be paid the same amount if you were to make that move voluntarily? And evidently, Google has launched a tool for employees to show how much they would be paid if they decided to live in a certain geographic area. So you could, I guess, type in your zip code of where you're going to be based out of, and it would adjust your pay accordingly or tell you what you could expect to be adjusted to. And apparently it's anywhere from 5 to 25% less than if you worked out of their corporate headquarters in a high cost of living area. So essentially what that's saying is that they're tying your value to where geographically you live. And let's kind of look at both sides of the coin, because I think that this starts to open up some pretty interesting compensation questions about distributed businesses or companies that have moved to a distributed workforce where they're now spread geographically across the globe. In a situation where you compensate somebody for a certain geographic region, they're supposed to be providing value that is reflective of the amount of compensation that you're going to give them. So in compensation theory, we should be paying people who add the most value to the business the most wages. And if you're somebody that is providing a high level of value, say you're an A+ employee and you live in Iowa and you're producing at a certain level, and you have somebody that's equally productive that's working in Silicon Valley, in theory, you're going to be adding the same amount of value to the organization. However, the person that lives in Silicon Valley could be making 20, 30, 40, even 50% more than you might be in your location. So what happens if that same person decides to move next door to you in Des Moines, Iowa, and now this person is maintaining their current compensation from Silicon Valley and you're both adding the same amount of value? It could create some pretty significant problems for internal equity from the business perspective. So I can see why that would be a potential issue. But on the flip side, we need to look at it from what kind of value does the employee drive for the business? In this case, once Google moved to a distributed or a more distributed workforce, essentially what they learned is that they actually are as profitable as they've ever been. And that's a pretty interesting statistic because it shows that companies moving to the remote workforce model have shown that the profitability is not affected. So in other words, the value that the employees are driving to the business is not affected by where they're located, or at least that's what we're learning in a lot of cases. And so there is a push for companies to move people back to the offices. And I think you're seeing some pushback there. And in fact, some companies have started to, they had a plan to move back to the office or return to the office, but now that's actually being adjusted. And I think Amazon just announced today that they have pushed back plans or decided to allow more flexibility for their individual teams to be able to stay remote if that makes more sense for those business groups. Whereas previously they had made a decision to return back to the office and they wanted to be a mostly in-person type of work environment. So essentially they've had to flex to the market, because essentially the market has determined that working remote is a much higher priority for a lot of job seekers. And especially in today's labor market where it is pretty competitive, and in particular in technology where it is extremely competitive, those types of advantages, it's almost going to become a standard issue, not something that is considered to be a benefit or a dangling of a carrot. And I think that these organizations are learning pretty quickly that in order to attract the top talent, they have to be competitive in the marketplace. So full circle back to Google and their situation with determining wage ranges based on the location. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out, whether or not that decision will backfire, or you'll see people be willing to take those pay cuts. But it does drive an even bigger question of, should you be compensated based on the value that you bring to the organization or simply by where you're located? And there is an internal equity issue that probably needs to be resolved. Either you bring the wage range to an equilibrium where everybody gets paid the same and maybe there's performance metrics on top of it, or you decide to continue paying people based on the location. In either case, it doesn't seem like it's a clear-cut great solution. There's pros and there's cons to each one. It'll be interesting to see what the turnover rates are and whether or not people will be more willing to jump ship, because I think one of the things that was a competitive advantage, especially for big tech, was that you could make significant increases in your wage ranges compared to some more smaller regional companies. But if that competitive advantage is taken away, then they may have to find other ways to stay competitive in the market. So what are your thoughts on the remote work piece and where you decide to live? Should you be paid based on the value that you actually bring? Or should you be paid based on the geographic region that you decide to live in? It's an interesting question, and one that compensation professionals are going to have to figure out pretty quickly. And that's all I've got today. Appreciate you watching. We'll see you on the next one.